There are people in this world who have learned to become invisible, not because they are weak, not because they have nothing to say, but because somewhere along the way in places that don't appear on any map doing work that will never appear in any record, they discovered that silence is not the absence of power. Silence is what power looks like when it no longer needs to prove itself. This is a story about one of those people, about what happened on an afternoon in the Arizona desert when a group of young soldiers decided to test a woman they thought they understood, about the moment they realized they had never understood anything at all, and about the kind of courage that doesn't make noise. Fort Caldwell sits in the high desert outside Tucson, Arizona, where the land is flat and merciless and the sun does not negotiate. In summer, the temperature on the tarmac reaches 108 degrees before noon. The air tastes like hot metal and diesel fuel. The mountains in the distance are the color of rust, and the sky above them is a blue so pale it looks almost white. It is not a place that welcomes softness. The base houses experimental targeting systems, prototype communications equipment, and weapon platforms that exist in classified budget lines, but not in any public inventory. The soldiers stationed there are trained to a high standard. They know their regulations. They know their chain of command. They know or believe they know exactly who belongs in their world and who does not. On the morning of August 14th, a woman named Marlowe Voss drove through the main gate at 7:03 in a white Ford F-250 with a contractor sticker on the windshield. She had done this before. She had done this at a dozen bases across 5 states over the past 4 years. She knew the routine. She knew the forms. She knew exactly which pocket held which piece of documentation. And she had learned long ago that the best way to move through a place like this was to move like someone who had always belonged there. She signed in at the security desk without being asked twice. She clipped her badge to the left chest of her gray work shirt. Not the right. The security sergeant noticed that. Small detail, but correct. Left chest is where you clip when you have been briefed on base protocols. Right chest is where civilians clip when someone tells them to just put it somewhere visible. He watched her walk toward Alpha Bay and said nothing. The maintenance bay at Fort Caldwell was a long, corrugated steel structure that ran along the eastern edge of the training area. Inside, the air smelled of machine oil and concrete dust and something faintly electrical, like ozone after lightning. A half-dozen targeting systems in various states of repair sat on elevated platforms under fluorescent lights. The generators in the adjacent building hummed at a frequency you could feel in your back teeth. Marlowe Voss set her tool bag down beside Platform 3 and took stock of what she was looking at. The system was a ground-based target acquisition unit used to coordinate live-fire exercises across a range that stretched 14 miles east. It was supposed to have been serviced 6 months ago. According to the maintenance log clipped to the platform railing, it had been. According to what Marlowe was seeing with her own eyes, it had not. She did not say this out loud. She took a knee, unzipped her tool bag, and reached inside. Her hand found the Leatherman before anything else. It always did. It was not new. The metal was worn smooth at the grip points, and the pivot had a slight catch that required a specific pressure to release cleanly. The blade had been resharpened so many times that it was a 1/4 inch narrower than when it left the factory. The pliers had been used in conditions that a warranty would never cover. It had belonged to her father. Staff Sergeant Raymond Voss, United States Marine Corps. He had carried that Leatherman from Camp Lejeune to Beirut and almost back. He died on October 23, 1983, when a truck loaded with 12,000 pounds of explosives drove into the Marine Corps barracks at Beirut International Airport. He was 29 years old. Marlowe was 4. She did not remember him. Not his voice, not his face from memory, only from photographs. But she remembered the Leatherman because her mother had pressed it into her hands the day she shipped out for the first time and said, "Your father never went anywhere without it, neither should you." She held it for one moment, the same moment she gave it every morning before starting work. A beat of stillness that was not hesitation. Then she opened the pliers and began. Her hands moved with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that speed and efficiency were not the same thing. She traced the mounting connections on the base plate, feeling for micro-vibration patterns that instruments rarely caught in early-stage wear. She tested the cable housing tension with her thumb. She pressed 2 fingers against the relay panel and held them there for 3 full seconds, reading heat differential the way a doctor reads a pulse. Most of the personnel moving through Alpha Bay that morning paid her no attention. She was another contractor, another maintenance ticket, background noise in the endless cycle of equipment that broke and got fixed and broke again. She preferred it that way. Corporal Derek Mast had been at Fort Caldwell for 11 months. He was 27 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that was almost handsome, and eyes that worked too hard at projecting authority. He had failed his NCO certification course in April. He had been passed over for promotion in July. These were not unusual setbacks for a soldier his age, but Mast had not processed them as setbacks. He had processed them as injustice. That is a specific kind of rot. It starts in the space between what a man believes he deserves and what he actually holds. It does not announce itself. It just slowly reframes everything around him. Every obstacle becomes an insult. Every superior becomes someone who fails to see his worth. Every person he outranks becomes an opportunity to feel, at least temporarily, that the scales are slightly more balanced. He had been sitting under the shade canopy on the south wall of Alpha Bay with Privates Ellis and Hadley since 9 in the morning, waiting on a maintenance briefing that had been pushed back twice. Mast had his arms crossed, watching the bay floor the way a man watches something when he has already decided to have an opinion about it. He noticed Marlowe Voss. She was somewhere in her 40s, he figured. Not in the way that translated to fragility. She moved efficiently, held her tools correctly, and worked without looking around for approval. That last part registered with him without him being able to say exactly why. People who did not look around for approval were harder to read. "What do you think she's working on?" Ellis asked. He was 22, still at the stage where everything was potentially interesting. Mast watched Marlowe press her fingertips along the junction box cover with focused attention that looked almost like listening. "Something she probably doesn't have full authorization for," he said. Hadley looked up from his phone. He was 24, quieter than Ellis, with a habit of being the last person in any group to agree with something. "She has a contractor badge." Contractor badges cover specific scope of work. They don't cover everything. He said it with the confidence of someone who has learned the vocabulary of authority without fully learning its purpose. He pushed off the wall and started walking toward her. Ellis followed without thinking, the way soldiers follow a corporal who is already moving. Hadley followed too, but a half step slower, something in the angle of Mast's approach setting off a low-grade unease he could not quite name. Marlowe sensed them before she heard them. It was not a skill built from training alone, though training had sharpened it. It was older than that, the awareness that develops in a person who has spent years in environments where being caught unready meant something far worse than embarrassment. A shift in the quality of the ambient sound, a change in foot traffic patterns behind her. She did not stop working. She did not look up immediately. But her weight shifted a degree or two, redistributed toward her right foot, her left knee dropping slightly lower to the concrete. Anyone watching closely would have read it as an adjustment in working position. It was also, without being anything else, the posture of someone who had already decided where they would move if movement became necessary. She marked a line in the dust beside the platform with her boot. Not straight, a curve like a hook. Then she looked up. "Can I help you?" Her voice was even. Not warm, not cold. The voice of someone who had learned to give people exactly as much as they had earned. Mast stopped 2 feet from her, close enough to establish that the space now belonged to him. "I need to see your work authorization. We have had issues with contractors exceeding their permitted scope." Marlowe looked at him for one moment, not studying him, not challenging him, just confirming what she had already suspected. Then she reached into her left cargo pocket and produced a folder. Documents in sequence, most relevant on top, everything tabbed. She handed it to him without comment. Mast opened it. He read with the focused expression of someone looking for a problem, which is different from reading to understand. The clearance codes were current. The authorization scope was broader than he had expected. Infrastructure assessment and maintenance, all support systems updated per the 3-month review cycle. He turned to the second page, then the third. Ellis was looking over his shoulder. Hadley stood back, hands in his pockets, watching the room. "Your authorization says infrastructure assessment," Mast said finally. "This system falls under tactical electronics, different category." Marlowe took the folder back. "It was recategorized 14 months ago. Support infrastructure includes all integrated tactical systems as of the January update." She said it the way you say something you have said before, not annoyed, accurate. She turned back to the platform and resumed work. The conversation in her assessment was over. It was not over. "I need you to stop work while we verify," Mast said. She did not stop. "You can verify while I continue. The update number is SOP-14-J if you want to pull it." Something shifted in Mast then. Nothing dramatic. A quiet internal recalibration that happens when a man who wanted an easy confirmation of his own authority, finds instead that the other person knows the territory better than he does. The reasonable response was to step back, say fine, carry on. Mass did not choose the reasonable response. We have also had concerns about unauthorized recording equipment being carried onto the base by non-uniform contractors, he said. New electromagnetic security protocols. I need to verify you are not carrying prohibited devices. The bay got quieter. Not because anyone stopped working, because the people who were working began to listen. Sergeant Roy Garrett, who had been at the far end of the bay, running diagnostics on Platform 6, paused what he was doing. He was 53 years old with 30 years of military maintenance behind him, and he had the awareness of a man who had spent those years in environments where a small situation becoming a large one was not theoretical. He looked at the group around Platform 3 and felt a specific cold weight of recognition. Hadley took a half step back. That is not current protocol, Marlowe said. Her voice had not changed. If you have a documented concern, I will refer you to my contracting supervisor and we can schedule a formal review. Full compliance verification. Standard for non-uniform personnel near sensitive systems? He was lying. Every person in earshot who knew the actual protocols understood that he was lying. The people who had quietly stopped working, Garrett, 3 other technicians, 2 soldiers near the exit, they knew it too. Ellis had his phone out. It was the reflex of his generation. When something happens, record it. He thought vaguely that this might be worth showing people later. Hadley saw the phone appear in Ellis's hand and felt something cold move through his chest. Put that away, he said quietly. Ellis did not hear him or chose not to. Marlowe Voss looked at Corporal Derek Mass for a long moment. Not the way a person looks when they are afraid. Not the way a person looks when they are deciding how to respond. The way a person looks when they have already decided and are giving the other person one final chance to choose differently. Mass did not take that chance. Turn around, he said. Full compliance check. The bay went silent. There are moments in a situation that function like hinges before and after the weight of what is about to happen, pressing against the air so that everyone present feels it before it arrives. Every person in Alpha Bay on that August morning would later describe the same sensation, the sense that the next few seconds were separating time into 2 distinct categories. What happened before and what came after? Marlowe set down the cable housing she had been holding. She set it down carefully at the same angle she had been holding it so the work could continue from exactly where it had stopped. Then she reached down and placed the Leatherman on top of her tool bag. That gesture was deliberate. That was a choice made consciously, and anyone paying close attention might have wondered about it. Why in this moment would she stop to set down a small tool with that particular care? Nobody asked. Nobody would have known what to do with the answer. She straightened up. Then without hurry, without any visible sign of distress or humiliation or fear, she began to undo her work pants. The sound of the generator seemed to get louder in the silence. She worked the zipper. She pushed the fabric down to her knees and stood back up. Straight spine, shoulders level. The concrete was hot, even through her boot soles, and the fluorescent lights above cast no shadow. She stood in the full exposure of that moment, the way you stand in the middle of a field during a storm, not because you cannot feel it, but because you have already decided it cannot move you. Satisfied, she said. Her voice was exactly the same as it had been throughout the entire exchange. Mask's grin had a cruel edge. He was performing now, working to an audience he believed was still with him. Turn around, full inspection. She turned. The afternoon light caught the lower part of her back. What it revealed was not what anyone in that bay was prepared to see. 5 marks. Stark and deliberate, running in parallel lines above her waistband. Not decorative, not the ink you acquire at a parlor in your 20s because you want something that means something. These were technical, angular, precise the way engineering diagrams are precise, the way things are precise when imprecision has consequences that cannot be absorbed. A gas mask in silhouette. Clean lines, no shading, the exact proportions of a military model. Satellite coordinates rendered in a notation system that only people who had worked in certain classified contexts would recognize. A syringe crossed with a lightning bolt, the symbol used in programs that officially do not exist to designate biological and chemical threat neutralization. A drone outline that matched no publicly available model, and a skull wearing night vision goggles. The young soldier holding his phone had been zooming in. He stopped zooming. Mask's grin faded in stages the way light fades when clouds come across the sun, not all at once, but steadily until the warmth is simply gone. Ellis lowered the phone without knowing why. Hadley had gone very still. Roy Garrett was already moving. Not running. A man like Garrett does not run toward things like this, but walking with the purpose of someone who has recognized something that requires his immediate presence and does not require explanation of why. And then from the east entrance to Alpha Bay, a sound. A clipboard hit the concrete floor with a crack that cut through the generator hum like a blade finding a gap in armor. The sound bounced off the steel walls and hung in the air. Sergeant Major Vincent Harlow stood in the entrance. He was in his late 50s, built not by a gym, but by decades of carrying weight in difficult places. His face was the face of a man who had made serious decisions under serious conditions and who carried those decisions the way a structural beam carries load, without drama, without complaint, because that is what it was designed to do. He had walked into Alpha Bay to review the week's maintenance logs. He had walked in at the exact moment Marlowe Voss turned around. His eyes found her lower back. Sergeant Major Vincent Harlow, 29 years of service, 2 combat deployments. The man who had read and shredded after-action reports describing operations in language so controlled it was almost surgical. Sergeant Major Harlow went pale. His 2 accompanying officers looked at him, then at each other, then followed his gaze to the woman standing half undressed in the middle of their maintenance bay. They did not understand what they were seeing. Harlow did. The marks on Marlowe Voss's lower back were not tattoos in any ordinary sense. They were mission tallies. Each symbol represented not a moment in a person's life, but a category of operation, the kind that got buried so deep in classified archives that even people with clearance were not supposed to know those archives existed. Ghost Vector. The names surface the way names surface when you have trained yourself to forget them. Ghost Vector had been a black program officially never acknowledged, staffed by operators who had been given new identities and civilian covers after the program's termination in 2013. They were the people called in when situations that could not appear in any record still needed to be handled. Chemical weapons already in transit, biological material in unstable hands, intelligence networks operating in countries where the United States officially had no presence, the gas mask chemical threat operations, the satellite coordinates intelligence extraction, the syringe and lightning bolt biological neutralization, the drone outline aerial surveillance development, the skull with night vision goggles close quarters elimination. 5 marks. 5 categories of work the United States government had done in places it had never officially been. Sweet mother of God, Harlow said. He said it quietly. But the bay was silent enough that every person present heard it, because Sergeant Major Vincent Harlow was not a man who said things like that. In 29 years, the soldiers who knew him had never heard anything close to it come out of his mouth. And when a man like that says a thing like that, the world stops moving for a moment and pays attention. Mast turned around. He saw Harlow. He saw the 2 officers. He saw the expression on Harlow's face and felt for the first time that morning something he was unaccustomed to feeling. Not the fear that comes from punishment, the kind that arrives when a man realizes he has stepped into something he cannot walk back from. Harlow's eyes moved from Marlowe's back to Mast's face. He drew a breath that was not audible but was visible, the breath of a man organizing what comes next before it arrives. Then Sergeant Major Vincent Harlow, 29 years, in the kind of man who had stopped raising his voice because he had stopped needing to spoke 5 words in a register that had the quality of a blade finding its mark cleanly. Stand down, Corporal, right now. The words entered the air and settled there like something physical. Mast opened his mouth, closed it. The generator kept humming. Marlowe Voss, still standing with her back to all of them, in the fluorescent light of Alpha Bay, waited. She had known something would resolve this. She had known it with the same certainty with which she knew things about metal fatigue and relay heat, and the way a system feels in your hands when it is working harder than its design allows. She had been in worse situations than this one. She had been in situations where the person in Harlow's position was not someone who recognized what they were looking at, was not someone who would do the right thing. She had survived those too. But she stood still now. And she waited because the situation was resolving correctly. And a person who has survived what Marlowe Voss had survived understands better than most that you do not interfere when the right direction is already in motion. Ellis's phone was in his pocket. He was not recording. He was not sure when he had stopped. Hadley was looking at the floor. He was going to be thinking about this day for a long time. Mast was looking at Harlow, who was walking toward him with the measured pace of a man whose destination is already settled. And Marlowe Voss stood in the hot light of that Arizona morning, 5 marks visible above her waistband, each one a story that would never appear in any official record, each one a debt the country did not acknowledge and could not repay. She was not embarrassed. She was not angry. She was waiting. And that, more than the marks, more than Harlow's reaction, more than the way the ground had shifted under Ma's feet in the span of 30 seconds, was the thing that no one present would ever fully stop carrying. The absolute stillness of that woman. The way she stood like someone who had been through the worst available and found on the other side of it a quality of calm that cannot be manufactured and cannot be taken by force. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of something. The kind that is what remains when everything unnecessary has finally been burned away. Harlow cleared the bay in 4 sentences. He did not explain himself. He simply walked to the center of Alpha Bay and told every person present that they had somewhere else to be, and he said it with the authority of a man who has long since stopped requiring his authority to be acknowledged before it is obeyed. The technicians left first, then the 2 soldiers near the exit. Ellis pocketed his phone and moved for the door without being told a second time, which was the most sensible decision he had made all morning. Hadley left last, pausing at the threshold for half a second, not looking back, just pausing in the way a person pauses when they know something significant is occurring behind them and want to carry at least the weight of it out with them, even if they cannot carry the understanding. Harlow looked at his 2 accompanying officers. The captain started to say something. Harlow shook his head once. They left. That left Marlowe Voss and Roy Garrett, who had not been told to leave and who had the judgment of 30 years to know the difference between a room he should vacate and a room where his presence was simply neutral. Marlowe was pulling her work pants back up. She did it with the same methodical focus she brought to everything else. She zipped them. She smoothed the front seam. She picked up the cable housing she had set down and placed it back at the angle relative to the mounting bracket where she had left it. Then she reached for the Leatherman and put it in her left cargo pocket. The sequence took 30 seconds. Harlow watched it and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say to a person demonstrating in real time that they were not available to be undone by what had just happened to them. "I need to make a call," he said. Marlowe glanced at him. "I will be here." He walked to the far end of the bay near the generator access door, where the ambient noise ran highest, and he dialed a number from memory. It rang twice before a voice answered that did not identify itself. Harlow gave his name, his service number, his location. Then he gave the name Marlowe Voss, the contracting company, on her badge, and a description of the markings he had seen. He listened for 40 seconds without speaking. His expression did not shift dramatically. It deepened the way still water deepens when you stop looking past it and start looking into it. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped beneath the generator hum. "Understood. And her current operational status." He listened. "Copy that." He ended the call and stood at the far end of the bay for a moment, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man quietly reorganizing his understanding of several things at once. Then he walked back. Roy Garrett had positioned himself at the respectful distance of a professional, close enough to observe, far enough to make clear he was not intruding. He was watching Marlowe's hands. He had been maintaining military equipment since 1995 long enough to know competence on site, and what he was watching was not competence in the ordinary sense. It was something that had been built under pressures he could only estimate. Marlowe was working the bearing housing on the target acquisition unit's primary rotation mechanism. Her left hand held the Leatherman, not using it yet, just holding it the way experienced tradespeople hold a familiar tool during assessment, as an extension of thought rather than action. Her right hand was pressed against the housing at a point that no diagnostic marker indicated. "What are you feeling for?" Garrett asked. He asked it as a professional, asking a genuine question. "Vibration frequency differential. The bearing race is wearing unevenly. You can hear the system cycling normally, but the wear pattern is offset about 15 degrees from true. The unit has been running under lateral load it was not designed to carry, probably 800 hours of accumulated deviation." Garrett pulled his tablet and checked the maintenance log. The system had been flagged 3 months ago for inconsistent target cycling during live fire exercises. The assigned technician had run the standard diagnostic, found nothing actionable, and signed off. "Standard diagnostic would not catch that," he said. "Standard diagnostic measures performance against specification. It does not tell you why the performance is degrading." She moved her hand 2 inches along the housing. "The why is in the metal." Garrett put the tablet away. He was going to remember that sentence for the rest of his career. Harlow came back and stood. He looked at Marlowe for a moment before speaking, and when he spoke, his tone had none of the command register he had used to clear the bay. "They tell me I am not authorized to ask about your previous assignments," he said. Marlowe did not stop working. "Then don't ask. I can provide whatever support you need to complete your work." She looked up at him, not warmly, not dismissively. I need to finish this repair and file my report. After what just happened, Harlow said, you want to keep working? The equipment does not care about what just happened, she said. It needs to work. Someone has to make sure it does. He nodded. He had the look of a man who has just received an answer to a question he had not known he was carrying. I will make sure no one interferes. She was already looking back at the housing. Garrett stayed. He told himself it was because Platform 4 was adjacent and also on his inspection list, and that was partially true. The more honest reason was that he had spent 30 years maintaining military equipment, and he had not seen anyone work like this woman worked, and he was not ready to stop watching. What she did over the next 90 minutes was not theatrical. From a distance, it looked like nothing methodical. Quite a woman working through a checklist. But up close, it was something else. It was thoroughness of a kind that thoroughness rarely achieves, not the thoroughness of following a protocol, but the thoroughness of someone who had learned in conditions Garrett could not fully imagine, that what you miss will come back to find you. She found the bearing wear and documented it. She found the relay panel running hot, not emergency hot, but hot in the way that precedes failure by several hundred hours, and she documented that. She found a mounting bolt on the secondary stabilizer that had backed off a quarter turn, the kind of thing that looks like nothing until high-tempo use puts real load on the system, and it stops looking like nothing very fast. Then she found a hairline fracture in a support bracket that Garrett would not have located with the standard inspection process for another 3 months. She found it by running her thumb along the weld seam at a location flagged in no protocol he knew of. How did you know to check there? He asked. This model has a stress concentration point at the secondary weld junction that the original design specs underestimated. The engineers identified it in the 2019 field review and added it to the updated inspection protocol. She paused. The updated protocol was not adopted here. Garrett checked his records. She was right. He stood there with his tablet in his hand and felt something that did not come to him. Often the specific humility of a man who is very good at his work encountering someone who is better at it, and understanding that what separates them is not talent, but a kind and weight of experience he cannot reach backward and acquire. Where did you learn to do this? He asked. She marked the fracture with a grease pencil. Places where the equipment had to work every time. 7 words. They landed with the weight of everything she had chosen not to say alongside them. They worked in silence for a while. The afternoon heat outside the bay peaked and began its slow retreat. The light through the west-facing vents shifted from white to something amber and horizontal, moving across the platform floors in long, narrow lines. Garrett spoke without looking up from his work. My father served in Korea, he said. Came home in 1953 and fixed trucks in Dayton, Ohio for 30 years. Never spoke about Korea, not a single time. He turned a fitting on the relay housing. He kept one wrench from his army kit in the bottom of his toolbox until the day he died. Nobody in the family touched it. It was just understood. Marlowe was quiet listening. When he passed, I took it out. Used it once on something in my garage. I wanted to understand what it was, why it was different from every other tool in that box. He set down his driver. Turned out it was just a wrench, exactly like any other wrench. He paused. That was the thing I didn't know until I held it. A tool doesn't carry what happened to it. The person who uses it does. The generator hummed. Marlowe's right hand moved to her left cargo pocket, and her fingers closed around the Leatherman without taking it out. She held it there, the worn grip familiar against her palm, in the way that only years of daily contact produces. He died when I was 4, she said. Her voice was the same even register it had been all morning, but something underneath it had shifted slightly, the way the quality of light shifts when clouds move without the sun disappearing. I have no memory of him, only photographs. And this. She did not take the Leatherman out, just held it through the fabric. My mother gave it to me the day I first shipped out, said he never went anywhere without it. Garrett looked at his own hands. Neither should you, he said softly. Not a question. Neither should I. They went back to work. The conversation had said what it needed to say. The afternoon heat outside Alpha Bay had peaked and begun its slow retreat toward evening when Breck Hadley came back. He came alone. He stopped at the entrance in the posture of a person who has rehearsed something and is now discovering that rehearsal and execution are not the same thing. He was in his mid-20s and he had the look of someone who had spent the better part of 3 hours in an argument with his own conscience. Marlowe saw him. She finished the connection she was working on, set down the cable housing, and waited. Hadley walked toward her and stopped about 10 feet away, the distance of someone not sure how close he was allowed to be. Ma'am, he said. He stopped. Started again. I should have said something. When he started, I should have stopped it. Marlowe looked at him the way she had looked at all of them that morning, not reading an adversary, reading a situation. I know, she said. He waited. He seemed to expect something more, absolution or anger or some transaction that would close the account between them. Marlowe did not provide it. Wanting to say something counts for something, she said. It does not close the account, but it counts. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, not with warmth that had not been earned, but without the closed door of someone who has decided a situation is finished. Why didn't you, she asked, not accusatory, the tone of someone asking a question they already mostly know the answer to, wanting to know if the other person knows it too. Hadley took a breath. He outranks me. That is one reason. Because, he stopped, because it is easier not to. She nodded, one slow nod. That is the real one. She picked up the cable housing. Now you know what it feels like when the easier choice wins. Hold on to that feeling. It is more useful than you think. He stood there a moment longer, then, yes, ma'am. He turned and walked back out into the heat. Garrett had heard the entire exchange. He kept his eyes on his work. At 3 in the afternoon, Harlow returned to Alpha Bay and told Marlowe that a formal review of the incident had been initiated and that the personnel involved would receive appropriate corrective action. He said it in the plain language of a man who has filed 100 such reports and who knows that the language of process does not do justice to the weight of what the process is trying to address. Marlowe looked up from the junction box she was reassembling. Did you tell them what the marks are? Harlow paused. I told them enough to establish that the conduct was inappropriate regardless of your background. She went back to the junction box. Good. The rest of it does not need to be in a report. Agreed. He watched her work for a moment. Then in a voice that had dropped to something close to private, Ghost Vector was officially disbanded in 2013. She did not stop working. Officially, she said. The words settled in the air between them like something with physical mass. Harlow was putting things together. The clearance level he was not authorized to ask about. The current operational status described to him on the phone in language, whose brevity said more than an explanation would have. The precision of her work, the way she moved through this base with the efficiency of someone who had moved through many bases, many environments, many situations, that would never appear in any record. You are not just a contractor, he said. She looked up at him. I have a contractor's badge. My authorization is current. My work is documented. A pause that was not hesitation but choice. That is what goes in the report. Harlow nodded. He had spent 29 years adjacent to the space between what is official and what is real, and he understood the function of people like Marlowe Voss, that they operated in that space so that other things could remain official, so that the country could continue to believe certain things about itself that would be harder to believe if the full accounting were ever made public. He had never stood this close to one of the people who lived in that space. At 3 o'clock, Derek Mast arrived at Harlow's office with his section leader, Staff Sergeant Raina Kowalski, who wore the expression of a woman who had been doing this long enough to know exactly what kind of meeting this was before it started. Harlow did not open with regulations or formal language. He sat down across from Mast and asked a question. Who did you think you were testing this morning? Mast looked at him. Sergeant Major, on Platform 3, you walked up to that contractor and you ran a process on her. I am asking what you thought you were testing. Mast's jaw moved. He was building an answer, something about protocols, about due diligence, something that would reframe what had happened as procedurally motivated rather than personally driven. Harlow waited. He was patient the way men become patient after watching enough explanations collapse under their own weight. The explanation did not form. Mast opened his mouth once and closed it. You were testing yourself, Harlow said. Not with heat, with the flat certainty of a man describing something he has watched happen before. You were testing whether you could take a situation and control it in a way you have not been able to control the things that have actually been eating at you. Your NCO course, your promotion. Mast looked at the table. Those results may or may not have been fair, Harlow said. That is a separate conversation. What is not separate is what you did with them. You turned them into permission to look for a target, someone you assessed as safe to press, and you pressed. Kowalski was very still. The woman on Platform 3 has a service record I am not authorized to read and you are not authorized to know about. Harlow leaned forward, elbows on the table. What I can tell you is this. There are people who have spent years doing work harder than anything you will face in your career in conditions you would not survive for a month for a country that cannot acknowledge what they did. That woman is one of them. You decided she was a target because she was quiet and alone, and you read that as smallness. Mass said nothing. She was never small, Harlow said. The size you were measuring was a story you were telling yourself. Today, that story got tested, and it did not hold. The air conditioning ran. The room was quiet around it. Kowalski had been Mass section leader for 9 months. She had known for most of that time that something like this was accumulating in him, not malice exactly, but frustrated energy with nowhere correct to go, and frustrated energy always finds somewhere to go eventually. She did not feel satisfaction that it had arrived. She felt the particular weariness of someone watching a preventable thing reach the point where it could no longer be prevented. 8 weeks of additional duty, Harlow said. Mandatory training, a letter of reprimand in your permanent record. He paused. And you are going to think about this conversation. Not because I am ordering you to, because if you are the kind of man I think you have the capacity to be, you will not be able to stop yourself. Mass looked up. His face had the quality of someone who has had several layers of something removed and is not yet certain what lies underneath. Sergeant Major, he said. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. The woman on platform 3, is she all right? Harlow looked at him for a moment. She filed her maintenance report, he said. She went back to work. Something moved across Mass's face, not one single emotion, but the complex expression of a man receiving an answer that is simultaneously a relief and an indictment. Dismissed, Harlow said. They left. Harlow sat at his desk for a moment, looking at nothing. Then he got up and went back to Alpha Bay. Garrett had signed off on 3 of Marlowe's documented findings by the time Harlow returned. He had used his full name and his service number on each signature, not required by the protocol, but the way Garrett had always signed things, he was prepared to stand behind completely. He handed the next sheet to Marlowe without ceremony. Outstanding work, he said. He said it with the specific weight of a professional who means the word in its precise sense and not as a courtesy. She took the sheet and signed it. I know you mean it. 30 years, he said. The bracket. I would not have found it for another 3 months. I want to be straight with you about that. The updated protocol needs to be adopted here. I will see to it personally, first thing tomorrow. She nodded. She was already moving to the next section. Harlow stood near the entrance and watched her from a distance. He watched her identify a safety wire showing early corrosion on the secondary anchor point, a thing that would have been fine for another month, and then suddenly and completely not fine. He watched her trace a barely perceptible vibration in a power junction to a loose grounding connection 3 feet away, located with 2 fingers and about 4 seconds of attention. Each finding was documented without drama or announcement. Just the steady accumulation of correct decisions made by someone who understood in her bones what the work was for and what was on the other side of getting it wrong. He had worked alongside excellence before. He knew what it looked like. It looked exactly like this. Not performance, not demonstration. The quiet gravity of a person who signs their name to things and means it. He pulled out his phone and called his commanding officer. He said that the contractor on Platform 3 had been subjected to inappropriate conduct by junior personnel, that the conduct had been addressed, and that in his professional judgment, the contractor should be given unrestricted access to complete her assignment and that any further interference would be treated as interference with authorized operations. His CO asked one question. Harlow answered it in 2 words. His CO did not ask anything further. Outside, the Arizona heat was breaking in the way high desert heat breaks not gradually, but in a shift temperature, dropping 8 degrees in 20 minutes as the sun moved behind the mountains. The light in Alpha Bay changed from white to amber and horizontal, coming through the west-facing vents in long, narrow lines across the platform floors. In that light, Marlowe Voss made the final connections on the bearing housing repair. Her hands were steady, her back was straight. The Leatherman was in her left cargo pocket. Garrett brought the completion form. She took the pen and signed her name with the same precise handwriting she had used on the entry log that morning. Then she looked at the form, not at her signature, but at the documentation of the work. 6 recommendations, a system that would perform reliably for the next 2,000 hours of use. She handed the form back. Who uses this system? She asked, not making conversation. Echo Company, Garrett said. Live fire certification next Thursday. She nodded. She began packing her tool bag. Every tool went back in the order it had come out, the reverse of the order she would need it next time. The Leatherman went in last, settled into the lower right corner, where it fit precisely where it had fit precisely every time for 4 years. She zipped the bag and lifted it by the shoulder strap. She looked at the platform one more time. Everything was as it should be. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. Harlow fell into step beside her. He did not offer to carry the bag. Personnel involved will receive formal corrective action, he said. I know. If you wanted to file an additional complaint, I don't. They walked in silence. Then Harlow said, Mast is not a bad soldier. He is a frustrated one who did not know how to carry it correctly. I know the difference, Marlowe said. I have worked alongside both. Outside, the desert air had the quality it gets in the early evening, the day's heat stored in the ground and rising while the air above it was cooling warmth from below and coolness from above at the same time. The sky to the east was darkening. To the west, the mountains were lit orange and rust. Marlowe stopped and set her tool bag down. Not to rest. She looked out at the training areas, the range markers, the target systems at 800 meters, the equipment, vehicles parked in their evening configuration lights beginning to come on over the maintenance structures. Harlow stood beside her and looked at the same thing. This is what they are defending, she said. Not to him, exactly. All of it. The ordinary daily running of it. He said nothing. She picked up her tool bag. I will be back next week for the follow-up inspection. You do not have to. I can assign. There is a hairline fracture on support frame 3 that needs a second check after the bearing replacement settles. I want to confirm the repair held before Echo Company goes out. She met his eyes. I signed off on this system. That means something. He looked at her for a moment, then, all right, next week. She nodded once and walked toward the main gate through the amber evening light of Fort Caldwell in the closing heat of a day that every person who had been present in Alpha Bay would carry for a long time. The gate sergeant on the evening shift was a man named Pruitt. 24 years of service, 3 deployments. The kind of face that had stopped registering surprise somewhere in the previous decade. He had heard through the channels through which things move on a military base, not gossip, exactly more like atmospheric pressure, that something had happened in Alpha Bay. He did not know the specifics. He knew the texture. He had been in this uniform long enough to know the difference between a story about someone getting caught doing something wrong and a story about someone discovering something true. This was the second kind. When Marlowe Voss came through the checkpoint at 1740 with her tool bag on her shoulder and her badge ready, Pruitt took it, verified it, and handed it back with both hands. Not one hand, both. He had not planned this. It was not a decision so much as a recognition, the way a man recognizes something that deserves a specific gesture and makes it before rational explanation catches up. Marlowe looked at him. She understood what it meant. Have a good evening, ma'am, Pruitt said. You too, Sergeant. She walked to her truck, put the tool bag in the passenger footwell, climbed in, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. She put her hand in her left cargo pocket. The Leatherman was there. It was always there. She held it without taking it out, the worn grip familiar against her palm, the slight catch in the pivot that required the specific pressure she had calibrated without thinking over years of daily use. The weight of it in her hand was the weight of a thing that had been in worse places than this parking lot on a hot Arizona evening and had come back from all of them. She thought about what Garrett had said, about the wrench in the bottom of the toolbox, about the day he finally took it out and used it and found that it was just a wrench, and what that discovery had meant. A tool does not carry what happened to it. The person who uses it does. She sat in the truck while the desert light finished its move from amber to blue, holding a dead man's tool being 4 years old and 32 years old and 44 years old simultaneously, the way time collapses when you hold something that has more history than you have lived. Then she started the engine and drove west toward Tucson, and the base disappeared in the mirror, and the mountains ahead were the color of iron in the last of the day. Derek Mast did not go to the enlisted club that night. He went to the motor pool. He was not supposed to be there after hours, but the night supervisor knew him and did not ask questions, and Mast found a vehicle with an oil change not due for 2 weeks and changed it anyway because he needed something with a defined start and a defined end and a result he could hold in his hands when it was finished. He was halfway through it when Garrett found him. Garrett came in quietly, set a coffee mug on the workbench within Mast's reach, pulled a maintenance stool to a reasonable distance, and sat down. Not close enough to impose, close enough to be present. Mast kept working. You're changing oil on a vehicle that doesn't need it, Garrett said. I know. All right. The motor pool at night had its own atmosphere, cooler than the day, the smell of lubricant and tire rubber, the low and constant presence of the base's overnight operations in the background. Mass pulled the drain plug, let the oil run. She came back to work, he said. After everything, she just went back to work. Yes, Garrett said. I watched her. He was quiet for a moment. I was watching her the whole time from the canopy. Before I went over, I told myself I was going over because she might not have the right authorization. But the truth was, he stopped. The truth was she looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and it bothered me, that she did not need anyone to watch. Garrett drank his coffee. I have seen people like her before, he said. Not often, maybe 3 or 4 times in 30 years. People who learned their skill in conditions where the margin for error was not measured in lost time or equipment damage. He paused. They move differently. They hold tools differently. There is no wasted motion because wasted motion was not a luxury they were ever given. Mast replaced the drain plug and wiped his hands. The Leatherman she carries, he said. When she set it down before all of it, the way she set it down. He looked at the shop rag in his hands. That was not just a tool. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He considered how much to say and then said the part that mattered. Her father died at Beirut in 1983, he said. She was 4 years old. She told me this afternoon. That tool was his. He set down his mug. She has carried it to every tomb, every base, every morning. For how many years I do not know, but long enough that the grip is worn to the shape of her hand. Mass stared at the oil running into the pan. She does not talk about what she did, Garrett continued. She will never talk about it publicly. The record does not exist. The acknowledgement does not exist. He looked at the far wall of the motor pool, the long rows of equipment in the half-dark. And yet she woke up this morning, drove to this base, and spent the afternoon preventing equipment failures that would have hurt soldiers she will never meet, because she signed her name to the work. That is the whole answer for her. She signed her name. The oil ran steady and slow into the drain pan. Mass sat down on the running board of the vehicle, elbows on his knees. He was quiet for long enough that the only sounds were the oil and the distant hum of the base. I tried to take that from her, he said finally. Not the clearance thing, not the protocol violation, that specific thing. A woman carrying her dead father's tool to work every day, and I tried to make her feel small with it in front of a people. He said it flatly, without self-pity and without performance. The way a man says something when he is not looking for a response, just putting a true thing into accurate language, because that is the only way to actually hold it. Garrett let it sit. Then he said, "You did not take anything from her. Look at what she did after. She picked the tool up and put it back in her pocket and went to work. You cannot take something from a person that is built the way she is built." Mass looked at him. "But you tried," Garrett said, "I thought, and you need to understand what you were trying to do. Not the regulation violation, not the protocol failure, what you were actually attempting." He stood. "That is the thing you take with you, not as punishment, as information about yourself." He picked up his coffee mug. "Get some sleep. 8 weeks of additional duty starts tomorrow, and you will need all of it." He walked out, and the work light held his shadow across the motor pool floor for a moment after he was gone, and then Mass was alone with the smell of fresh oil and the distant sound of a base that was never fully quiet, and he sat there on the running board for a longer time with nothing to do but think, which was he was beginning to understand exactly what Harlow had intended. The following Thursday morning, Marlowe Voss drove through the main gate at Fort Caldwell at 7:15. A different gate sergeant, this time younger first posting, who checked her credentials with professional efficiency and waved her through. She parked in the contractor lot and walked to Alpha Bay. The bearing repair had held. She had known it would, but she checked it anyway because Echo Company was certifying tomorrow, and her signature was on the system, and her signature was a commitment, and a commitment was not something you made conditionally. She ran her fingers along the support bracket where she had found the hairline fracture. The repair compound had cured correctly. She checked the adjacent welds while she was there, because she was there and it cost nothing to know. The margins were adequate. She documented the follow-up inspection, signed off on the system. Echo Company was cleared for Thursday morning. Garrett appeared at 9:30, looked at her documentation, confirmed her findings against his own records from the previous week, and signed as witness with his full name and service number. He added a line outside the standard signature box, which was not required by the protocol, but which he had decided was warranted. Outstanding assessment. 30 years I learned something today. With a man like Garrett, that sentence carried the weight of everything he had not written alongside it. Relay replacement is scheduled for next week, he said, closing his tablet. Parts came in yesterday. Watch the mounting torque on the secondary bracket when you do it, she said. The spec is 12 foot-pounds, but this model runs better at 10.5 in this climate. Thermal expansion differential at 110 degrees creates binding at full spec torque. He wrote it down, word for word. At 11:30, Harlow came in, not between appointments, intentionally. He walked to where Marlowe was packing her tool bag and waited for a natural pause in what she was doing. She gave him one. Follow-up is solid, she said. System is certified for tomorrow. I read your report from last week, he said, 3 times. She looked at him. The downstream implications in each finding. The operational risk, the personnel exposure, the timeline built around Echo Company's certification date. He paused. Most contractor reports tell you what and how. Yours told me why it matters and what happens if it is not addressed and when it needs to be addressed and in what sequence. He paused again. That is not knowledge from a technical manual. No, she said, it is not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to ask you something. You can tell me it is not my business. She waited. Do you want to be acknowledged? Not today, not this incident. In general, for the work you have done, the years of it, formally, officially, in the way the institution is supposed to acknowledge that kind of service. The bay was quiet. Garrett was at the far end, not looking at them, hearing every word. He did not pretend otherwise. Some things are worth being present for even when you are not part of them. Marlowe looked down at her tool bag. Her hand found the zipper pull, but did not close it. She was looking at the leatherman in the lower right corner. My father served 22 years, she said. He died at Beirut in 1983. He was 29 years old and I was 4, and I have no memory of him except what my mother told me and what this feels like when I hold it. She touched the tool without picking it up. His name is on the wall in Washington. I have been once. Harlow was very still. Standing in front of that wall, I tried to work out what he would have thought of it, of having his name there, of people coming to find it and put their fingers on the letters. She looked up, not at Harlow, at something he could not see. He would not have been against it. He was not that kind of man from everything I know of him. But I do not think he would have said that was the reason. She looked at the leatherman. He did what he did because the work was in front of him, and it needed doing, and he was the person who could do it. That is the whole of it. There is nothing more to it than that. She picked up the leatherman and put it in her cargo pocket. So no, I do not want acknowledgement. What I want is for the system to function correctly tomorrow when Echo Company goes out. For those soldiers to come back from the range and never once think about whether the equipment was going to hold. That is the acknowledgement. When nothing happens, when everything works and nobody has cause to notice. She closed the zipper on her tool bag and stood. The people who need to know what the work cost are the people who did it, she said. Everyone else just needs the work to be good. Harlow looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had spent his career in an institution that ran on formal recognition ranks and citations and ceremonies, in the careful language of commendation. He had believed in that system and still believed in it and knew that it served important purposes. But he was also old enough and honest enough to know its limits. To know that there was a category of service the system's vocabulary could not hold without losing something essential in the attempt to express it. He was standing in front of that category right now. All right, he said, it was not dismissal. It was the response of a man who has received a complete answer and recognizes its completeness. She nodded once and lifted the shoulder strap. Garrett appeared at the edge of the bay, at a distance calibrated to be present without intruding. He looked at Marlowe. Safe travels, ma'am. Thank you, Roy. First name. He received it without comment, but something in his bearing settled the way a structure settles when a final piece finds its correct position. She walked toward the exit. On the south wall of Alpha Bay, in the shade of the canopy where Derek Mast had stood 8 days ago, with his arms crossed and his judgment already formed, Breck Hadley was eating lunch on an equipment case. He had positioned himself near the window, not because he was waiting for anything in particular, but because the shade was real and the light was good, and it was Thursday. He saw Marlowe Voss come out of the Alpha Bay entrance with her tool bag on her shoulder. He watched her walk, not quickly, not slowly, with the economy of someone whose body had long ago stopped expending energy the situation did not require. Footsteps behind him. He turned to find Derek Mast standing at the window. Mast had not been looking for the window. He had been cutting through the shade canopy on his way to the afternoon brief and had looked up at the right moment. or the wrong one, depending on how you measured such things. They stood together at the window, Hadley and Mast, and watched Marlowe Voss cross the lot toward her truck. She came back, Hadley said. She said she would. Silence. She was most of the way across the lot now, the tool bag not shifting on her shoulder, her stride unvarying across the concrete. I have been thinking, Mast said, about what Harlow said, about the kind of work she did, the kind that does not exist in any record. He watched her reach the F250 and set the tool bag in the footwell and close the door. She wakes up and she drives to a base like this one and she fixes equipment and she signs her name to it and she goes home. And nobody outside this gate will ever know any of it happened. Hadley thought about this. Does she need them to, he said. Mast watched her walk around to the driver's side. I think about her father, he said, the man she carries with her, the one she was for when she lost. I do not know his name. I know what he left behind. I can see it from here, the shape it made in her. He paused. But I do not know his name. You don't need to know it, Hadley said quietly. She knows it. Mast turned to look at him. Hadley was watching the lot, and his face had the expression of someone working something out in the act of saying it. Everything she did that nobody will record, Hadley said. All the places and the years and the things she carried home from them. She knows what they were. She knows every name. He paused. The fact that we don't, that is not a failure of the record. That is the whole structure of it. Some things happen so that other things can happen. And the people who make them happen do not need you to trace the chain. They just need you not to be in the way, the F250 started. They could see the slight vibration of it from the window. Mast was quiet. The truck backed out of its space and turned toward the gate. I was in the way, he said. Hadley did not answer. There was no useful answer. The statement was complete and accurate, and the only response was the one Mast was already living to understand it fully and carry the understanding forward correctly, which was harder than any of the things he had thought were hard before this week. They watched the truck move toward the gate. Pruitt was on duty again. He saw the F250 approaching and processed the exit, handing the badge back through the window with both hands as he had done a week before. The truck rolled through. They watched it until it reached the access road and turned west, and then the desert in the distance took it, and there was only the heat and the mountains and the wet Arizona sky, and the base going about its work around them, as it always had, and would continue to do long after all of them were gone. In the years that followed, Fort Caldwell changed in the ways that bases change units, cycling through equipment, turning over personnel, arriving and moving on in the continuous human current that runs through every military installation. The specific incident in Alpha Bay became with time one of those stories that loses its details while holding its weight. The crew chiefs and maintenance supervisors who had been present that August morning found themselves working differently afterward without being entirely able to say why. There was a slower reflex toward assumption and a quicker one toward the question of what they might be missing, an attention to what was actually present rather than what they expected to find. Garrett updated the inspection protocol for the targeting systems within 2 weeks, incorporating the stress concentration check Marlowe had identified at the secondary well junction. In the orientation he gave to new maintenance personnel, he told the story of the well junction, not as a technical lesson, though it was that, but as a lesson about the difference between knowing a specification and understanding a system, between reading an instrument and reading the material itself. He never used her name. He never needed to. The lesson held its shape without it. Mast completed his additional duty without complaint. He passed his NCO certification in March of the following year on his third attempt, and when he received his sergeant's chevrons, he held them in his palm and was still for a long moment before pinning them on. Kowalski, who was present at the ceremony, noticed the stillness and understood something about it that she did not need to articulate. He became, in the assessment of the people who served under him, a careful and demanding NCO, one known specifically for the attention he brought to situations involving contractors and civilian personnel. Not in the way of someone demonstrating a corrected behavior, in the way of someone who has genuinely added a piece of understanding and applies it without fanfare. The soldiers under his charge could not have named the origin of that quality. That was as it should be. Harlow kept Marlowe's maintenance report on his desk for the rest of his time at Fort Caldwell. When junior personnel came into his office, he sometimes used it as a teaching reference, not discussing who had written it or what had surrounded the writing of it, but showing the format, the structure, the way each finding was connected to its downstream consequence, the way the documentation expressed not just problems, but their meaning and their stakes. This is what it looks like when someone takes their signature seriously, he would say. This is what professional work actually means. He retired 2 years later after 29 years of service. At his retirement ceremony, he received a citation in the formal language that such citations use precise and complete and appropriately impersonal. He accepted it with the dignity the occasion called for. In the inside pocket of his dress uniform, jacket folded carefully, was a copy of a maintenance report for a ground-based target acquisition unit at Fort Caldwell, Arizona. He had made a copy within his authority, and he kept it not because the document required keeping, but because it represented something he had not found the right formal language to describe, and he had stopped looking for the formal language and decided the document itself would have to be enough. The kind of work that is its own record, the kind that lives in the correct functioning of everything it touches, the kind whose measure is the absence of failures that never occurred and the safe returns of people who never had cause to know how close the margin was. Marlowe Voss drove west out of Fort Caldwell in the late morning light of a Thursday in August, the desert flat and enormous on both sides of the highway, the mountains ahead in the middle distance. She drove without music. She had the engine and the road and the clarity of a morning in which the work had been done correctly and the documentation was filed and nothing remained unfinished except the world which always remained unfinished, which was the reason there was always work to return to. Her left hand rested on the wheel. Her right hand rested in her lap, 2 fingers loose around the Leatherman in her cargo pocket. She thought about Garrett's father and his wrench and 30 years of trucks in Dayton, Ohio. She thought about the weight of ordinary work done by people who had left harder things behind them and continued forward anyway, who had chosen the work as a kind of answer to questions nobody had asked them directly. She thought about Pruitt returning her badge with both hands and what that gesture had contained. She thought about the wall in Washington and her father's name on it and what he would have made of a Thursday like this one, the bearing and repair confirmed, Echo Company cleared for tomorrow, her signature on the documentation, and the documentation filed. She thought he would have recognized it, would have understood it without needing it explained across whatever distance exists between the living and the dead, in the way that people who have done serious work recognize it in the work of others. She thought he would have said, "Good. That is what it is for. Keep going." The highway ran straight west through the high desert. The mountains were coming closer the way mountains do when you drive toward them in open country slowly, and then suddenly more present, more specific, the individual ridges and shadows becoming visible, where before there had been only shape and color. She took the Leatherman out of her pocket and set it on the console beside her, not to look at it, just to let it rest in the open for a while where the light could reach it, where it had been carried and what it had meant and who had held it first. None of that was visible in the worn metal and the resharpened blade and the pivot with its familiar catch. Garrett had been right about that. The weight of a thing does not live in the thing. But the light moved across the worn grip the way light moves across anything that has been handled by human hands for a long time, finding the places where contact has made its mark, where the surface has been shaped by use into something that no longer looks quite like it did when it left the factory. She drove. The mountains came closer. The day was ordinary and the work was done, and the desert was enormous around her, and somewhere behind her at a base that would go about its business for decades after everyone currently stationed there had moved on a targeting system, was calibrated and certified and ready, and tomorrow morning soldiers who would never know her name would take the range with equipment that would perform exactly as it was supposed to perform. That was the acknowledgement, when nothing happened, when everything held. Some service records are classified, some are simply never written. The people who kept you safe last night did not ask you to know their names. They asked only that the work be good enough to matter. Most of the time it was. Ghost Vector was officially disbanded in 2013. Officially.